All right, next up, we have another amazing speaker. Hopefully this one won't make us cry. It's my great pleasure to announce Natalie Schmitz, MPA, PharmD, PhD, Dr. Natalie Schmitz, excuse me. She's an assistant professor in pharmacy practice division of University of Wisconsin School of Pharmacy and the faculty leader of the University of Wisconsin Carbone Cancer Center, Cancer Pharmacology Lab. Prior to joining UW, Dr. Schmitz earned her Master of Public Administration in PharmD at Drake University and then pursued her PhD in experimental and clinical pharmacology at University of Minnesota while working as a medical cannabis pharmacist. Dr. Schmitz's expertise in clinical pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and cannabinoid therapies. Dr. Schmitz's translational research program focuses on evaluating the role of alternative and complementary therapies, particularly cannabinoids, in supportive care by investigating pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, exposure-response relationships, safety, and efficacy. Dr. Schmitz, take it away.
Thanks, Paloma. And although she's not here, thank you, Brittany. I mean, those patient stories are really why we do what we do. So really appreciate that introduction. So a little bit on my path. I'm from Minnesota, Prior Lake, and as Paloma said, I went to Drake in Des Moines to get my PharmD and PhD, and subsequently realized I really enjoyed the research aspect of things. So while I was working on my PhD in Minnesota, I was working on spasticity. And as you noticed from Chris's presentation, that was one of the initial qualifying conditions for medical cannabis. And I went to a grand rounds of someone that was previously with Minnesota Medical Solutions, now Green Goods, and was learning about medical cannabis for neurologic implications and spasticity. And initially, I just thought, well, I'm kind of a square. I don't know about this medical cannabis stuff, but my stipend is minimum wage, and I could use a part-time gig, and I'm a pharmacist. And pharmacists can dispense medical cannabis, so this sounds like a good part-time gig for me. But from there, I really grew and saw the implications that medical cannabis has, as Brittany just highlighted, but also saw what we're using to guide these patient decisions is really limited. As we heard, a lot of the research is retrospective, or not rigorous, placebo-controlled, gold standard clinical trials. So that's what I'm working on at University of Wisconsin now. My research focuses on translational research and complementary therapeutics, mostly cannabinoids, specifically for supportive care, mostly in cancer patients. So I have two major pillars of my research program, one looking at cannabinoid efficacy, the other population health. Within each of these pillars, looking at different components. So for cannabinoid efficacy, looking at a neuropsychiatric symptom cluster. So that includes pain, sleep disturbances, and fatigue. And I'm sure you can imagine how each of those really just feed into each other and make that cycle worse. Also looking at neuropathic pain, particularly in patients on taxane chemotherapies, so patients with breast cancer, patients with ovarian cancer. A lot of those patients have peripheral neuropathy, so we're looking at topical CBD for that, and also looking at sleep. Sleep in the neuropathic symptom cluster, but also sleep in REM sleep behavior disorder, and I'll talk about that disorder and the consequences of that disorder a little bit later on. And then for population health, we're looking at the Minnesota Cannabis Database Registry, which David will talk about a little bit later. But we're trying to tease out, we see symptom improvement, but what combinations of THC and CBD are most promising? What doses are most promising? What routes of administration are most promising for a certain condition? And then also looking at stigma, public perceptions, education or need for education in different providers and patients. So a little bit more background on the cannabinoid efficacy areas that we're looking at. Pain, fatigue, and sleep disturbances are some of the most common symptoms for patients with cancer. And because these often occur together, they're classified as a neuropsychiatric symptom cluster. And over half of patients, almost up to 80% of patients, particularly GI cancers, report these symptoms. And if these symptoms are uncontrolled, those can have cascading effects, whether that be mood disturbances, impaired function, decreased quality of life. And even though there are medications to suit each of these individual conditions or symptoms, a lot of them still aren't adequately controlled or not controlled at all. Additionally, if we could meet or address these symptoms with one therapy, we would decrease pill burden, we'd reduce adverse events. Some of these patients are taking one drug to solve the side effects of another drug, reduce the likelihood for drug-drug interaction, improve quality of life, and potentially improve treatment outcomes. Because when patients are having these side effects, sometimes they aren't coming back for their appointments. They're not continuing with their treatment. So ultimately, if we can have improved patients' quality of life, we could improve treatment outcomes. And particularly for these symptoms, CBD is a great option. Particularly, I'm in Wisconsin, so we don't have the luxury of a state medical cannabis program. We're surrounded by states that have either medical or recreation programs, but we have none. So for our residents, CBD is a great option. And there's a number of therapeutic properties of CBD that make it well suited for these conditions. It could improve sleep, has analgesic properties, anxiolysis. It immunomodulates and has an antioxidant properties. So going through 3 of our studies for cannabinoid efficacies, these are ongoing studies, so I don't have results for these studies for you yet, but I'll talk about how we're structuring these studies and who we're looking at them in. So particularly for this REM sleep behavior disorder group, REM sleep behavior disorder is when people are acting out their nightmares. And not only can that be disturbing for their bed partner and potentially injurious to their bed partner, 85% of these patients go on to develop Parkinson's disease. So the bigger picture, the thought with this study is if we can improve sleep, can we change the onset of Parkinson's disease, particularly with some of the neuroprotective properties of CBD. So this is just a first step in that bigger picture, but the objective of this study is to look at the effects of CBD on sleep in patients with this REM sleep behavior disorder and characterize the correlation of the dose of the CBD with sleep events. So we're looking at 3 different doses, 75 milligrams, 100 milligrams, and 300 milligrams in a repeat dose measure. So we're looking at this over 30 days, and it is placebo-controlled in 30 subjects. Our primary endpoint is dream enactment events as reported by the patient and their bed partner, but we also are going to have a camera in the bedroom to record those sleep events to verify that patient-reported estimate. And then we're having a number of different questionnaires. There's an RBD questionnaire, different sleep quality index, sleepiness scales. As I mentioned, we're having that video recording, also using kind of like a Fitbit type actigraphy watch that will record sleep movements and the clinical impressions of the patient and of the physician. Our second study is for that neuropsychiatric symptom disorder, so pain, sleep disturbances, and fatigue. And this is in patients with pancreatic cancer, because as I mentioned, GI cancers have a high occurrence of these symptoms. So here we're looking to evaluate CBD for this symptom cluster, as well as look at some inflammatory biomarkers and see if we can shift those biomarkers at all. So this is, again, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study of CBD and pancreatic cancer. In this study, we're doing more of a self-titrated instead of the 3 outlined doses, because as you've heard, different doses are going to work well for different patients. And in this study, the CBD product that we're using is Epidiolex. So that's the FDA-approved version of CBD, and that'll be donated by Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And our endpoints for this study are a symptom cluster severity overall. We're looking at a number of other ways to evaluate these symptom clusters, how it impacts their daily life, their quality of life, the impressions of the patient, and the impressions of the clinician. And then, as I mentioned, those inflammatory biomarkers, CRP, interleukin, and TNF-alpha. Our fourth efficacy study, this is the segway study that will eventually lead to looking at topical CBD for patients on taxane chemotherapies. But as an initial step, no one yet has really well quantified how well absorbed, distributed, and excreted topical CBD is. So this is a first step towards looking at topical CBD in peripheral neuropathy. And the first step is to understand how this works in healthy humans. So we'll be looking at 3 different doses of topical CBD in healthy volunteers and look at the pharmacokinetics or how that's distributed throughout the body. And that'll be done at different time points. So we'll have a 30-day washout period for each of those routes of administration. We're comparing oral to topical to have a good comparator. All right, so moving into more of the population health studies that we're working on. First is looking at the Minnesota Cannabis Database Registry. The next is asking cannabis survivors what their perceptions and use is around cannabis-derived products. And the third is understanding pharmacists' perceptions and recommendations around cannabis or cannabis products. So the first, we're partnering with David and his team to evaluate medical cannabis patterns of use and the correlated symptom improvement. So here we're looking at demographic data, different physician specialties, the self-evaluation form that you'll hear more about later, but this evaluates anxiety, appetite, depression, sleep, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, and pain. And what we're trying to see is in patients that we're seeing an improvement in symptoms, what products are they using? What's their overall dose? What's the ratio of THC to CBD to provide more direct recommendations? And that analysis is ongoing right now. We plan to have a poster this October. The next study that we're doing is surveying cancer survivors. So there's a system in Wisconsin of various conditions, and this is through the Survey of Health of Wisconsin, and they have I just got an email today, I think 640 cancer survivors, and for their surveys, they get about a 50% response rate, which is really unheard of for surveys. So these are highly engaged patients, really looking to share their experience and opinions, and what we're going to ask them is, are you using cannabinoid products? How frequently? What are your attitudes or your beliefs around these products? What are the perceived norms? Do you feel comfortable sharing this with your friends, your family, your providers? How does the legal aspect, specifically in Wisconsin, impact your beliefs and your comfortability using and personal agency? Our last study is the one we have results for, so kind of end with a bang. This was a survey to Wisconsin pharmacists, and these were people in all different practice areas, but remember, this is Wisconsin, so we have a CBD program, but no THC, and even the CBD program is very restrictive. But we're surrounded by Michigan that has recreational and medicinal, Illinois recreational medicinal, Minnesota medicinal. So, a lot of patients, from Madison, Rockford is an hour away. So if they really want medical cannabis, they'll go and get medical cannabis or recreational cannabis. You can't get medical. So it's important for particularly pharmacists who are so easily accessible to patients, whether it's at Walgreens or the local pharmacy, to be able to communicate and have a high level of understanding how this works with other drugs and be able to guide these patients a little bit. So when we surveyed Wisconsin pharmacists, we really found that 59% weren't at all familiar with dosing. They had very limited understanding of any short or long-term adverse effects. Majority weren't familiar with potential pesticides or cannabinoid content discrepancies that there may be at different programs. There were major knowledge gaps in some of the key clinical use, the pharmacology, the pharmacokinetics, the things that pharmacists know for other drugs, but they have no understanding of this for cannabinoids. Despite lack of understanding, some of them are counseling. About 50% are counseling on cannabis, whether it be monthly, weekly, or daily. And the majority of them, about 70%, recognized that this was a deficit for them and were interested in additional education. And this isn't to put anything bad on Wisconsin pharmacists, because we're finding the same throughout the U.S. 90% of pharmacists in the U.S. get questions about cannabis, but 50% aren't comfortable counseling on these products. And about 80% also report lacking knowledge in the pharmacology and pharmacokinetics and dynamics of cannabis products. And this is really similar to what we saw in the reports for Wisconsin pharmacists. Again, over 50% don't counsel on CBD or cannabis products. Over 50% don't have the knowledge that they need, don't understand contraindications or drug interactions, but need more education. So we're taking steps at Wisconsin to try to address some of these education gaps. To address these gaps in practicing pharmacists, we created a 13.5-hour or 13-module CE course that's offered through the University of Wisconsin. And we're also focusing on educating the next generation of pharmacists. So I've integrated several lectures throughout the required curriculum, and we also have an elective course now for pharmacy students that are interested in getting a little bit deeper than just what 1 or 2 lectures can provide. And that same course that's an elective for PharmD students is also in the required curriculum of the new Master's in Psychoactive Pharmaceutical Investigation at the University of Wisconsin. So this master's is a one-of-a-kind master's that's new. We're also looking at psilocybin, LSD, a lot of these other up-and-coming alternative therapeutic options for some of these conditions. So before wrapping up, I'd like to acknowledge our study team and collaborators that are working on a lot of these projects, and our supporters and our funders for these research projects. And if you have any questions, please ask now, or feel free to reach out if you have any research ideas, interest in collaborating, or any questions. Thanks.